Kamal, we've entered the grey zone. Do you see what I've done there?
I think I do, Camilla.
Yeah, it's clever, isn't it? I'm talking about Sue Gray, Keir Starmer's chief of staff, who has ended up in the headlines for all the wrong reasons this week. A bit like her boss, actually.
She has. She's taken a pay rise and she is now paid more than the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer. So Sir Keir Starmer's going to have even more reason for taking some freebies.
He's hard up.
He's paid so little that Lord Alli's going to have to put his hand back in his deep trouser pockets to find out what else he can give the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom.
So we're going to be talking about Sue Gray, Keir Starmer, freebies and more. We're also going to be discussing working from home. Amazon has called workers back to the office or factory floor. Jonathan Reynolds, the business secretary, says more of us should be working flexibly. And now there's the suggestion, Kamal, that teachers should be working from home.
More than suggestion, there is schools where teachers are now working from home, which has caused some controversy. So we'll be discussing flexible working. Has it gone too far? And just finally, a question I'm really excited to ask of you, Camilla. What makes you working class? Kemi Badenoch, Tory leadership hopeful, has said that flipping burgers in McDonald's, which she did, made her working class. We're not quite sure that the class system works like that, but we'll be discussing how working class are we.
Welcome to the Daily Tea with me, Camilla Tominey.
And me, Kamal Ahmed.
Question for you, Kamal. Who's greedier, Keir Starmer or Sue Gray? Is that harsh? Am I being harsh?
I feel that's a little harsh. I don't know if Sue Gray is greedy or not. I've got some thoughts on Sir Keir Starmer, which we'll get to in a moment. But we're picking up on the BBC, which has reported that Sue Gray asked for and was given a salary of £170,000 a year, which is £3,000 more than the Prime Minister and certainly more than any other cabinet minister or her Conservative predecessor as Chief of Staff and Number 10, Liam Booth Smith, who was paid a maximum of £145,000. The BBC also said that Sue Gray was actually asked to not take that salary increase to avoid the controversy, which it has now become, of being so well paid.
But they've denied that, haven't they? Should be said. So Miss Gray has said that that's categorically untrue and that she had no involvement in any decision on her pay. Interesting, Kamal. This isn't the first time that she's hit the headlines. It's difficult, isn't it, when you're an advisor, because you're very much meant to be in the background. But because she had a profile already, because she was in charge of the Partygate inquiry into Boris Johnson and others during COVID, this woman has almost become a bit Dominic Cummings-like in that ordinarily, I mean, you mentioned Liam Booth Smith earlier. Would many people in the street outside know who he was? I think now Sue Gray's got that little bit of a kind of recognition factor going. And that's difficult for Keir Starmer because if she attracts a bad headline, it then reflects badly on him. So we haven't just had this salary story. We've also had stories about her exerting sort of too much influence with the Number 10, getting into battles with Morgan McSweeney.
He's the Director of Strategy.
Director of Strategy there. So we've got the typical inside Number 10 tugs of war going on. She's also been implicated. She's got this interesting past. She's the daughter of Irish immigrants. She's got a very close relationship with Northern Ireland. She lived there for some period in between being a civil servant, having a break, and then going back to being a civil servant.
She ran a pub for a while, which seems most random.
With her husband. And there was a suggestion that she's again exerted influence over some of the decision making with regard to funding for Casement Park, which is a stadium in Belfast. So that's rung a few alarm bells. And there is, we talked earlier about two ongoing problems for Keir Starmer, one Sue Gray and the other Freebies. Can we tie those two stories together? Lord Alli paying for spectacles, suits, Lady Victoria's dresses, and the Sue Gray saga. Well, there is a link because Lord Alli, during the election campaign, donated to two different campaigns of wannabe MPs. One of them was Liam Conlon, who is Sue Gray's son. So he received 10 grand from Lord Alli and he went on to be elected as the Labour MP for Beckenham and Penge. So it's all just looking a bit murky. And this is the party, a party of duty. Leave the sleazy days behind.
Turn the page.
Turn the page.
What's the biggest thing, Camilla, that if you are in politics and you are the government, the first rule is if your officials are the story, you're in a terrible place. And what has happened is, and their defence is thin, i.e. the rules have been followed. Well, the public look at that and say, well, if the rules have been followed and no rules have been broken, the rules are wrong. On the freebies issue, on the issue of the giving of gifts, and does that create an ability to gain access to power which wouldn't be available to other people, the perception looks like Sir Keir Starmer, who has now been revealed as, I think, the party leader that has got the most in gifts of any party leader.
Yeah,
previously.
£107,000 worth of freebies, which is apparently more than double the second person on the list, which is Lucy Powell, who got £40,000 worth of freebies. So he's not only topping the list, but my goodness me, he is well ahead of the game when it comes to grasping.
If you start asking voters who don't engage in politics in a day-to-day way that we do as journalists, if you ask them fewer than 100 days into this new Labour government, what is being the conversation about this Labour government? What are they going to say? They're going to say winter fuel allowance, £22 billion black hole, and things are going to get worse. It's very, very gloomy. Sue Gray and splits within the government. It's all a bit of a fight inside number 10. And Sir Keir Starmer takes a lot of freebies. It doesn't look very good, does it?
No. Oh, and maybe they keep on wanting to ban stuff.
Possibly
He's
that.
authoritarian.
And what I'm finding, talking to officials within government, is that their defence, which is, we followed the rules, there's nothing to see here, this is just a conversation that has no substance, just the kind of defences that were put forward by the last Labour government, where spin and all these issues became really, and internal battles became really, really part of the destructive Labour narrative. The very fact that Keir Starmer has got into this position so rapidly, so quickly, that his popularity ratings have collapsed since the election shows that this stuff matters. And it is the policy vacuum that we've got from this Labour government that has meant it has been more readily filled by stories like tickets to Taylor Swift concerts for him and his family or his
Twice,
friends.
actually.
Twice.
We now discover that Lady Victoria, who is now being nicknamed rather unkindly Victoria Sponger on social media, didn't just go to Taylor Swift once for free, but twice, which strikes me as a little excessive. Kamal.
So when you get the business secretary, we'll hear this in a second, but when you get someone like the business secretary who is doing the media rounds today, Jonathan Reynolds, he's there to talk about flexible working and new ways of working and what is the business secretary doing for growth. Oh, no. That's not the discussion that people are going to remember from that. Let's hear what Sky's Kay Burley asked him about, and it certainly wasn't policy.
£170,000 worth of freebies for the boss, £20,000 in the last 8 weeks alone. Interested to hear your defence.
Well, I would say there are a number of ways supporters support any political party, particularly in opposition political party, and sometimes that's support for campaign literature, sometimes it's support for staffing costs, sometimes it's of more of a personal nature, but I have no objection to that, and we have very clear rules and transparency in place in this area, so I have no objection to how the system works.
2.5 times more than the next nearest MP. He said recently, choices we face are that things will get worse before they get better. He's declared more in the last 2 months on freebies than the average wage.
But this would relate to his job, the professional side of his life, being the leader of the opposition or the Prime Minister. And there's a lot of pressure on that role. There's a lot of scrutiny of that role. Again, there's full transparency in place. So I don't see any objections, and where in some cases it relates to perhaps an event, a sporting event of some kind, of course, I think people would reasonably expect the Prime Minister to be in, say, a director's box at a sporting event if they were there, partly for security, partly because it will be something they, yes, enjoy doing. But again, I have no objections to that.
The interesting thing about these responses, Kamal, is they are inadequate. I refer back to me interviewing Nick Thomas Simmons at the weekend. He's the he's the paymaster general. And in response to kind of the freebie question, he kept on saying, well, they're in high profile positions. They've got to wear nice clothes. They've got to look good. And any commonsensical response to that is, well, I'm in a high-profile position because I'm on the telly once or twice a week and I pay for my own clothes.
Also, they don't have to look that good.
No,
they
don't.
They can get a suit from M&S and look absolutely fine.
Or they can get their glasses from Specsavers.
One of the weakest, I thought, Camilla, was, it's important that he's at important cultural events. What, like a Taylor Swift concert or an Arsenal match?
Yes.
No, you can feel
so he can be in touch with the public.
Your interview with on GB News was so good, and you can hear with Kay Burley and Jonathan Reynolds, their answers are halting because you can feel them remembering their lines to take because they don't naturally agree with what they're being asked to say.
But even Starmer himself hasn't handled it well. So when he's been asked about why you're always taking corporate hospitality at various football stadia around the country, including his beloved Arsenal, he said, oh, well, for security reasons, I can't be amongst the supporters in the stands. I thought to myself, I'm sure I've seen imagery of Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister in the stands in Southampton, which he supports, with great enthusiasm. And then I looked back and I just thought, I'm going to check this out. So I asked a few people, and lo and behold, when he was Prime Minister only in May, I think he'd probably called the general election at that point and could probably be described, to be honest, as a bit of a hate figure among the left at least. He's there in the stands with his mum and dad. So what's Starmer talking about? We've got this revelation by Robert Peston of ITV that he has now been allowed use of that corporate hospitality at the Emirates Stadium. So he can go into that box. I think if you had to pay for a ticket, it would cost you £8,000 a pop. This isn't man of the people stuff.
And we've revealed, this is the thing, isn't it? This idea that this government is like the voters. We've discussed that before. We've revealed today that he has used Lord Alli's £18 million penthouse apartment in central London. He used it on election night. It's that idea of a set of rules for me and a set of rules that are different for the rest of the country. And also the inability politically to close this down. So, as you say, his response has been to say it's about security or, other areas. But then he also said, yes, he imagined he would take further gifts.
Oh.
And you're this is exactly the opposite of what you should be saying, because how are you going to close this story? And I think that gets to a deeper problem about number 10, which is much, much broader than even Sue Gray and the Freebies issue, which is this lack of political grip at the centre. Sue Gray is a crisis fighter. I think we've both spoken to people who have worked closely with her or know her well. And one very, very senior former civil servant I spoke to said to me that Sue Gray is very good at, there's a crisis, this is the person that needs to be in a room, that's the person that needs to be in a room, and that's how we need to sort it out. What she doesn't do is policy formulation, how to create communication narratives, how to manage stories, and that appears to be a real gap in number 10, that either Keir Starmer is maybe aloof, he's not taking the right kind of advice, but I think a bigger question is, how is he being advised on policy so that he's not misstepping on things like winter fuel allowance, but he also knows how to handle, and he can smell politically this is really damaging for him.
He doesn't have that antenna. He isn't a good politician. That isn't the way we do this. I mean, the same criticism could be levelled at Rishi Sunak, really, as Keir Starmer. They're technocratic, they're bureaucratic, they are saying that they're hard-working and across the detail, and they can't see around corners. They haven't got the political nous to say to themselves, if you're going to go to Taylor Swift not once but twice on freebie tickets, it might not look great. It might not look as if you're in touch with the working man and woman. It may come back to haunt you. And then, as you say, to double down and say there's nothing wrong with it shows a degree of, unfathomable political naivety. I was just going to say on some of these quotes about Sue Gray, it's a dual problem because she also has been accused of lacking political nous. There's some quotes today in all of the newspapers. For instance, it is open season on her. She is losing her authority fast, and it already looks like her departure is inevitable. Gray has been accused of fighting with friends she's not made yet and showing, as I said, this extraordinary lack of political nous. What was interesting about that day when I went down to Downing Street to report for the Daily Tea on the arrival of the new Prime Minister and his wife, Sir Keir and Lady Starmer, was that Sue Gray had a real presence in Downing Street that morning. There were Labour activists everywhere. Suddenly Sue Gray made an appearance, and it was like, oh, the Labour waves are parting for Sue Gray. Like, she was being really treated as if she was something very special and, may I say, quite enjoying it. And the trouble with that is it's a bit like the Cummings effect. I mean, you assume untrammelled power, and you have this thing, we've had reports about her moving McSweeney's desk further and further away from the Prime Minister's because she wants the Prime Minister's ears. Every time I hear these tales, it's mirrored in royal life, by the way, arguments between aides about who's closer, who has got the principal's ear. It always ends in tears for the most ambitious in that position. It's funny, the people who think that they're doing all the right things to ingratiate themselves next to power actually usually are the first to fall off their perch or be pushed.
The fact that it's leaking as well should cause Keir Starmer to worry. There is not the discipline he needs internally, so the story's getting out. And of course, he hasn't got a consistent position. He was the person who complained when Dominic Cummings was given a pay rise in his position as Chief of Staff for Boris Johnson. So yet again, Keir Starmer says one thing in opposition, behaves differently when Prime Minister. That's another confusion. Yeah. And the public notice. Let me just go through some of the polling figures. So a really interesting graph. Number of days since winning an election that it took to get a poll rating that fell below 30% for your party. So you're the election winner. How quickly did it take for your poll rating for your party to fall below 30%? If you go through the list of every Prime Minister right back to Harold Wilson, let me just see if you could answer any of these, Camilla. How many days do you think it took for John Major's, for the Conservatives' poll rating to fall below 30% after John Major won the 1992 election?
Quite some time, because it must have nosedived heavily after Back to Basics was then followed by his affair with Edwina Curry, and then all of the sleaze and cash for questions stuff. So I'd say a good 2 years.
Yeah, not about 400 days. So
okay.
Over a year.
Yeah.
Over a year. Theresa May. I was quite surprised by Theresa May, actually.
Theresa May. So
yeah.
We're going with 2015, not 17. It all starts tanking after 2017, doesn't it? So I would say again, like 450 days.
Yeah, no more, over 600. So yes,
wow. Okay,
20
a bit more
for
for
all
her.
of that period.
Yep.
She kept ahead. Thatcher very similar to Theresa May. Boris Johnson nearly 800 days. Tony Blair, your favourite person.
Oh, God.
10 minutes.
I can tell. I can tell.
Little twinkle in my eye. Camilla.
Yeah, there's a
Little
twinkle
hint
in your
to you.
eye. So clearly, Tony Blair became. It took longer to become less popular, I would say. And let's be honest, he was in for a long time. So we're talking about probably more than 3 years for Tony Blair for the master slip. Some of us spotted it on day one.
Slip, for goodness
but
sake.
did it take about 3 years before he started waging war in the Middle East? Yeah.
1,200 days.
You're proud of that, aren't you?
Little
Pathetic,
twinkle
honestly,
in the eye there.
honestly.
And then let's try Keir Starmer.
Has he?
For the Labour's poll rating to fall below 30%.
The fact that you've even got this graph suggests it's already happened.
You've done the maths.
Wow. So how long has he been in office? 100 days yet?
Not even 100 days. 100 days is October.
What, so he's below 30 already?
Below 30. So the quickest: John Major, Harold Wilson, Theresa May, Margaret Thatcher, Boris Johnson, Gordon Brown, Tony Blair. Keir Starmer is the fastest falling Prime Minister for the poll rating of the party he leads.
Is that because when he was elected he wasn't that popular anyway?
That is true, but you would expect,
you
would expect, Camilla, there should be a bounce. There should be a bounce. You are in control. This is the big issue. You should be in control of the agenda, not being led by the agenda, and he hasn't managed to do that. I think there is one interesting question, Camilla, which I'd love to hear your thoughts on. take away from the freebies, which as we have discussed on this podcast, Sir Keir Starmer should have responded completely differently to all these free offers that he's had from different organisations, different football clubs, etc., etc. To put to one side as well, Sue Gray. I think Sue Gray is a crisis fighter. She's not the type of policy creator that someone like Tony Blair had with Jonathan Powell and Peter Hyman and people like that around him. She does not fulfil that role, and that shows a weakness in number 10. But on the pay issue, what is your take on the idea that the reason that prime ministers, cabinet ministers, maybe even officials become trapped in these horrible narratives of greed, snaps from the trough, etc., is because we simply don't pay them enough? Should we pay our prime minister a huge amount more?
Well, initially I thought yes, because I thought that other world leaders were paid a lot of money. So we were chatting about this earlier, and it's like, well, maybe if you give him £500,000 a year, he doesn't need to ask for anything for free. And then I had two further thoughts. The first one is he's paid nearly 170 grand. So he really must be able to afford the odd Oasis, Taylor Swift and Arsenal ticket. Point one. I mean,
and I assume he's not. Well, sorry, I don't assume. He's not paying sort of his rent. He doesn't go and buy his shopping.
No, he's
he
got some accommodation in central London.
Yes, very
Admittedly,
nice.
he's got his other home in North London. I would assume, by the way, that those two have probably paid down the mortgage. You know, I don't think they're going to be shopping in the basics range at Sainsbury's, let's be honest. He had an illustrious career as a lawyer. I don't know if you know, but his wife does work for the NHS. I don't know how much she earns, but they're a double income earning family. And by the way, the last time I checked, they sent their children to state school, which means that they're not paying fees, which have now got VAT added, so they should be in the clover. Okay, so I initially thought, oh yeah, pay them more and then they won't have to take freebies. But I think the solution is actually just stop taking freebies, please. Let's have a look at world leaders around.
Yeah, I'm quite surprised because I went over to, we have a wonderful production team who help us put together the Daily Tea. And I went across and I was exactly like you, Camilla, and I asked the team, let's have a look at the numbers from around Europe.
Yes.
I bet they get paid loads. And so they've come up with the list. Let's go through it. So President Macron, I know he's not the Prime Minister, but actually the Prime Minister earns slightly more than the President in France. So President Macron, he earns the equivalent of about £162,000 a year.
Yeah, I'm just looking at Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, because as the German economy is tanking, he's on £304,000 a year, including 35 grand a year for, quotes, official expenses. Can I just make a point on expenses? Can we not forget that MPs do still claim expenses? Can we not forget that the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, on 160 grand a year, claims back her fuel bill on her second home, claims back her transport to go between London and her constituency? This is the case for all MPs. And by the way, I think that's right, because I don't think it's fair for an MP. You have some MPs who have constituencies really near London, and it's all very easy and they just have to have one home. If your constituency is in the northwest and you're constantly commuting back and forth from Westminster, then I think you should have some degree of subsidy. But they're well paid, these people.
The big shock to me, and this is to all of you and our Italian listeners, which we know we have many, many millions of, I'm absolutely sure. But Giorgia Meloni, Prime Minister of Italy, £97,000. Georgia, who's buying your beautiful pink suits?
Well, she's probably buying them herself. The US presidents earn more, don't they? So they're on $400,000, which is about £301,000. But in addition to that, they're entitled to $50,000 for expenses, $19,000 for entertainment. What does that mean? And $100,000 non-taxable travel account. And they've got access to Air Force One.
Yes.
Because, of course, our politicians have to share their aircraft with the royals, darling.
They do.
The highest earning world leader is where, Kamal?
Well, I've read it. I'm sorry. So I've read the briefing note. I'm so sorry.
Can you just
even I
pretend?
can't
Because
pretend.
we
No,
don't.
even I can't pretend.
Do you want to ask me because I did drama GCSE?
Yes, is Singapore's Prime Minister Lawrence Wong, who is on £1.66 million equivalent.
1.66 million, but then everyone in Singapore is meant to be loaded.
Well, and
unless
also they do run an incredibly powerful economy and make lots and lots of money. I would say I think that the Prime Minister should be paid more money. It is, I think we are too hair-shirt about how much we pay the people at the top, only at the top of politics?
But you've
Is it
used
encouraging?
that phrase before, this hair shirt thing, and I know what you're saying. Look, do we want a political system where no one does anything? We want our Prime Minister, for instance, to be at the final of the Euros, if we get into it, or the World Cup.
Doesn't have to buy a ticket for that. No,
no,
understood.
But you know what I mean? Like, you've said hair shirt before, and I'm thinking, are we just being real party poopers here? It's interesting, actually, you were thinking about Boris Johnson. I was sort of thinking there was an irony about Partygate and there was an irony about Wallpapergate, because actually most people could identify and quite like Boris Johnson because he wasn't that kind of person. Boris Johnson was a person who was much more interested in being in some dusty library with a load of classics books. I mean, do you remember that imagery of his Toyota Previa, which was like full of old bits of cheese? Apparently he's still driving this car around. He's made all of this money. He's not motivated by material things. And in a way that made him a bit more man of the people-ish. Bear with me, I know he's an old Etonian and all the rest of it. But he's the kind of guy who would turn up on a bike, you know, his shirt half untucked, go and have a pint.
Isn't that a little affected, Camilla? Because he has got... his whole thing was he goes on very, very wealthy holidays.
Yeah, paid for by Zach Goldsmith.
he turns up...
People thought that was more his wife's appetite for foreign travel than his.
I'm not sure. This affectation of, I've just got to put myself together.
You think it's affected, but are you not... I'm saying that I don't think, and we can go back and look at the Register of Interests, we're not going to find that Johnson was as grasping as Starmer. Is there something about the champagne socialism of all this? You're talking about hair shirts. We've had Keir Starmer sort of talking. I think he's overdone it. He hasn't quite said that he was brought up in a cardboard box in the middle of the street, but he's really played on this idea. It was all very difficult. I appreciate his mother was seriously ill. Let's just take that out of the equation. My father was a tool maker. Actually, if you drill into it, his father ran that factory.
If you drill into it, see what you did there?
Yeah, love that. If you hammer down into the detail of it, Kamal. So he's trying to position himself as being thoroughly working class. He goes to this grammar school. It ends up being fee paying, but, you know, his parents don't pay the fees because he's on a bursary. So there's this narrative of poverty that connects him to the common man. And yet this behaviour it reminds me of the royals. You know, the royals are absolutely minted and love freebies. They have to declare their gifts. But I heard many, many anecdotes of royals over the course of time. They connect themselves with very wealthy people. Those very, very wealthy people, as you say, Kamal, give them free holidays. I heard a story about one royal. I don't know if I can. There are too few of them to name, really. You know, I remember hearing a story about one royal about, you know, these fleeces were handed out at this event, and this royal had to make sure that they got their free fleece. And you're thinking,
that's the aristocracy. They're like that,
yeah,
aren't
but
they?
This is the thing.
They have falling down.
This is the circle of class. You know, socialists and aristocrats.
No. I think
they just want free stuff.
No, I think I have a slightly different analysis. I don't think Sir Keir Starmer can be beaten with the same stick that you could beat Tony Blair and that idea of 1990s champagne socialism, which was let's all be rah, rah, rah and go to parties and call Britannia and all that. I think that Keir Starmer simply lacks political nous. He likes going to things, people offer him stuff, and he goes to them. He doesn't think through the consequences, what perception is, and therefore what political damage this is doing.
But if he doesn't think it through, he's a hypocrite then.
I think hypocrisy could definitely be an accusation laid at his door. I don't feel that Keir Starmer is a champagne socialist. I don't think he wants to be sort of surrounded. You know, he loves having a pint in his local. He still plays five-a-side football.
But he must like the finer things in life if he's quite happy to be shacked up at Lord Alli's £16 million flat.
18 million, I think, actually.
Oh, so, I mean, it's hypocrisy, by the way, Kamal, always gets them in the end. You put yourself on that pedestal. All of these social media posts are coming back to haunt him because he was so holier than thou. Now he's being burned on the cross. That's what's happened.
Well, talking about class, after the break, we'll listen to what makes Kemi Badenoch working class.
Welcome back. Kemi Badenoch, who's currently favourite in the Tory leadership race, has spoken to our former colleague, Christopher Hope, for his GB News podcast, where she spoke about her class, Kamal. And she gave it quite an interesting spin. Should we have a listen?
it was the first time that I interacted properly with people who didn't come from the sort of background that I came from. I grew up in a middle-class family, but I became working class when I was 16, working in McDonald's. And just understanding, how many people there were single parents and they were working there to make ends meet.
Because they have to work?
Yes, and there's a humility there as well. You had to wash toilets. There were no special cleaners coming in. You had to wash toilets. You had to flip burgers. You had to handle money. So it taught me a lot about just, work skills.
We're privileged. Our jobs are privileged, I think, talking about ideas and thoughts. But a lot of people's jobs are like that.
Yeah.
And it's how you connect with that.
Yeah, and it wasn't a weekend job either. I was doing it so that I could eat.
Yes, all right.
Okay, it is a very funny clip, and clearly it doesn't make you working class, the fact that you once worked in McDonald's. Now, I'm going to ask you, Camilla, what maybe is your equivalent, and then maybe we can talk about what makes class. I think she's probably trying to make a slightly different point, which is she experienced what it was like to be somebody who had what might be described as a working class background. But of course, the bit that's been clipped up has made a bit of a joke about her saying, and it reminded us, didn't it, Camilla, when we were speaking about it this morning before we recorded the podcast, of the Rishi Sunak interview I think he did when he was at Winchester.
Yes.
Let's just hear the painfully cringing answer he gave when he was asked about his friendship and class.
I have friends who are aristocrats, I have friends who are upper class, I have friends who are, working class, but I'm not working class, but I mix and match, and then I go to see kids from an inner city state school and tell them, to apply to Oxford and talk to them about people like me, and then I shock them at the end of chatting to them for half an hour and tell them I was at Winchester and, one of my best friends is from Eton or whatever, and then they're like, oh, okay.
You're going to laugh at this. I mean, do you regard me in any way to be working class?
Camilla, you are my closest working class friend. Now, tell us about
we are on the working classes in that we work hard.
We do work
We
hard.
put in the graft. But this made me laugh because I perhaps am, if we are going to be judged by our teenage jobs, I worked at Waitrose.
In the home counties by any chance?
Yes, it was in Harpenden, in Hertfordshire.
Harpenden, well-known working class town.
Indeed. I worked on the
Was that a mining village?
Maybe back in 1702. To be fair, my grandparents, I would say, were working class people. But there's been a bit of social mobility that has gone on. Apparently, even the lefties think this is a good thing, by the way.
Yeah, good for the Tominies. Well done, worked hard.
Thank you so much. So I worked in Waitrose on the delicatessen and the patisserie. Had an interesting experience there, Kamal, because I was fired from Waitrose.
Say it ain't true.
And do you know why?
Go on.
A little old lady who may have been fairly upper class came up to the counter one day and said, "Excuse me, my dear, would it be possible for you to call me a taxi?" And I said, "Sure, you're a taxi." A supervisor found out that I had mistreated a customer. I was told to hang up my apron and my netted hat that I had to wear. And I never worked at Waitrose again.
That famous Tomini humour got you into trouble once more.
I thought it was quite funny, but in Harpenden in the 1990s, that wasn't the way that one behaved.
I always described myself, much to the irritation of nearly everybody in my sort of close circle of family and friends. I consider myself to be lower middle class, so that my parents,
you're just middle class.
No. I've always, much to the irritation of my family and any loved ones and friends, have always described myself as lower middle class. We didn't have brought up by a single mother,
also known as middle class.
No,
but go on.
Anyway, didn't have a huge amount of money. Brought up by a wonderful single mum, but I did have what maybe Kemi Badenoch would describe as a working class job, because I was a white van man delivering computer goods around the southeast of England in a white transit van.
And how did that go? Did
Well,
you like driving the transit van?
I did enjoy it
Were you
enormously.
good at driving it?
I was very good at driving my van. I did have a couple of bumps and scratches, but I was mostly okay at the job. But I did make a slight joke about myself as well. I wasn't sacked for it, but I used to drive around with a copy of The Guardian on my dashboard.
It should have been a rolled-up copy of The Sun.
I know. But I did destroy The Guardian because everyone thought I was far too ridiculously not of the working classes to be white van man. And I also used to play Radio 3 at top blast when I drove into the warehouse to collect my parcels.
That went down really well with
Didn't
your
go
colleagues.
Down very well.
Yes. How long did that job last, Kamal?
It was every holiday when I was at university. But surprisingly, one of the other white van men at this company was a guy called Mark Savage, who will be known to some of our older listeners as Gripper Stebson, the bully in Grange Hill. So there we are.
Wow, what a revelation from you, Kamal. I've got a vision of you in a cartoon strip with a massive sausage coming into the frame.
And people used to joke with Mark Savage. I think he's still, a pretty well-known actor, but obviously he was between acting jobs. We used to say, go over to him and say, oh, Gripper, don't take our lunch money.
We've got Gen Zs in the gallery looking at us going, Grange,
what is Grange Hill?
What are you talking about? Look it up, kids. Look it up.
The thing with the Kemi Badenoch clip, which has been tightly edited and has gone viral on social media, similar to Rishi Sunak, is that the Conservatives always have this uncomfortable relationship between they're standing for the voters, but the voters aren't like them. And it's always a difficult space for them to navigate.
Well, some voters are like them.
Yeah, no, but the general mass of voters
Yes.
are often not like them.
Yes.
And they find that sometimes difficult
But I
to
find
navigate.
it hard to cope with discrimination against posh people.
I'm not discriminate against them.
No,
I'm just
some
saying
people
that that's-
do. I know, but you know this whole kind of, Bullingdon Club and you're Elditonian and how dare you, you're privately educated. How dare, Tory scum, the Angela Rayner thing. You wouldn't dream about saying that about working class people.
Yeah.
Why can posh people be attacked?
And there's a little thread here, isn't there, back to the discussion about Sir Keir Starmer and Sue Gray, which is about not being hypocritical. I think you're absolutely right. Rishi Sunak should be very proud of his background, what he's achieved, as should Kemi Badenoch, and they shouldn't be criticised for it. But don't mangle your words when you're trying to discuss other people who aren't like you.
Amen to that. Kamal will be driving here in a white van tomorrow, 5 p.m.